Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight we're taking a ride down the winding back roads of the Appalachian Mountains with 12 true road trip horror stories. Encounters that prove, sometimes, the scariest part of the journey isn't the destination, it's the road itself. Before we dive in, let me know. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, let's step into the darkness together. Story number 1. We had been in Nepal for a week when it happened. Margaret and I were staying in Pokhara, near the lake, taking in what we thought would be one of the most peaceful stretches of our holiday. Our driver, Rajesh, had been with us since Kathmandu, a kind young man, quiet, dependable. That morning we'd planned only a short trip along the lakeside. We stopped for photographs, strolled for a bit, then were approached by a man who seemed to be in his 50s, weathered but smiling warmly. He asked if we'd join his family for tea at his home, just a short walk uphill. Margaret hesitated, but I said yes. It felt rude to refuse. The walk was longer than I'd expected, and steep. We followed him up narrow stone steps into a small cluster of houses. His wife served us sweet, milky tea in chipped mugs, and his daughter brought out fried bread. It was friendly, but there was an odd undercurrent. He didn't make much conversation after the initial welcome, and when I asked about his work, he gave a vague answer and smiled without showing his teeth. Margaret, ever polite, kept chatting to the daughter, who didn't seem to speak much English. We stayed about 40 minutes before I said we ought to be getting back. The man nodded and walked us halfway down before stopping abruptly, saying he had something to attend to. We continued down the path on our own, a bit unsure of the turns, but eventually reached the road where we'd left Rajesh and the car. Only the car wasn't there. At first I thought we'd walked to the wrong spot. We paced back and forth along the road, scanning for the white Toyota. It was unmistakable, but there was nothing in sight. Margaret spotted something on the gravel shoulder. One of our suitcases. Open, clothes spilling out. My stomach tightened. We rushed to it, finding our other bag a few yards away, split open, contents scattered as though tossed in haste. My camera was gone. So was Margaret's handbag. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. We decided to walk toward the nearest police post we'd passed earlier that morning. It was only about 10 minutes away. When it came into view, my relief was cut short by the sight of blackened walls. The small wooden structure had been burned, not smoldering, but clearly gutted sometime earlier. The roof had collapsed inward. Margaret's hand gripped mine tightly. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered. I had no answer. We stood there debating whether to keep walking into the town or go back uphill to find the man who'd invited us. Neither option felt safe. We chose the road toward the busier part of Pokhara, thinking we'd find someone to help. After perhaps 15 minutes, we heard an engine behind us. I turned, ready to flag it down, but it was our car. Rajesh was driving. We both ran into the road, waving. He pulled over but didn't get out. His face looked pale, his eyes wide in a way I hadn't seen before. He told us to get in, quickly. We did. Margaret immediately asked where he'd gone, what happened to our bags. He didn't answer right away, just kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Finally, he said he'd stepped away to relieve himself, and when he came back, there were 3 men around the car, pulling our bags out. He shouted and ran toward them, but one had a knife. He backed off. They took some things, then ran toward the hills. He didn't mention why he'd driven off without our luggage, but I didn't press. I could see his hands shaking on the wheel. He said we needed to go somewhere safe, and when I asked what that meant, he said a friend's place, not the hotel. That set off an alarm bell in my head. We drove away from the lakeside, not toward the town center, but up a narrow, winding road. I told him I wanted to go to the hotel instead, but he said the men might follow us there. Margaret's voice rose, demanding he turn around, and he did, reluctantly, muttering that we didn't understand. When we reached the hotel, the manager listened quietly as I explained. Then he pulled Rajesh aside. They spoke in low voices. When Rajesh left, the manager told us not to leave the hotel for the rest of the day. There are problems in that area sometimes, he said. He wouldn't explain further. We spent the afternoon in our room, curtains drawn, listening to distant shouts from somewhere outside. By evening, I'd decided we had to leave Pokhara early. I arranged a car through the hotel for the next morning, not with Rajesh. He never came back. The replacement driver was a man in his 40s named Deepak. As we drove out the next day, Margaret asked him about the burned police post. He frowned and said it had been attacked 2 nights earlier by locals angry over an arrest. Then he added something that made my skin crawl. He said there were rumors that certain families lure tourists off the main roads, sometimes for theft, sometimes worse, and that they often work with people who know the tourists' movements. I thought about the man who invited us for tea, about how long it had taken, about the way Rajesh had vanished. I wanted to believe it was just a chain of unfortunate coincidences. But then Deepak glanced in the mirror and said quietly, "You were lucky." Very lucky we didn't speak for the rest of the journey back to Kathmandu. Even now, years later, I still feel the tightening in my chest when I think of that hillside path, the scattered clothes on the road, and the blackened frame of the police post. Whatever was supposed to happen to us that day didn't happen, but I can't shake the feeling that it was waiting just a little further down the road. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. Story number 2. I'd been riding for 12 days straight, averaging nearly 100 kilometers a day, raising money for a cancer charity. That night, outside Perpignan, I was exhausted enough to stop anywhere that offered shelter. The rest stop I found wasn't on my planned route. I hadn't even seen it on my GPS earlier, but when I saw the dim sign, I figured it was safer than pushing on in the dark. There was no one else around. No cars in the parking area, no voices, nothing. Just a low, blocky building with a row of vending machines along one wall and a couple of benches under a shelter. I locked my bike to the bench leg, sat down, and ate a protein bar. My phone showed 2 bars of signal, then 1, then none. I assumed it was just the location. I tried messaging my sister to say I'd arrived somewhere for the night, but the message spun and never sent. I decided I'd just call her in the morning when I got moving again. I zipped my jacket, lay down on the bench, and closed my eyes. When I woke, it was still dark. My first thought was that I'd overslept, but the air felt heavy in that strange way you get before dawn. I sat up and reached for my bike, and my hand closed on empty air. For a second, I thought I'd just reached in the wrong direction. But when I turned my head fully, the bike was gone. My helmet, my panniers, my water bottles, everything I had for the trip was gone with it. I stood up, heart pounding, scanning the area. There were no lights in the parking lot now. None. The vending machines were dark. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal, no Wi-Fi, no GPS. The time said 4:13. My power bank was in my pannier, so I couldn't waste battery. I tried calling emergency services anyway, and the call just failed immediately. No ringtone, no static. It's hard to explain, but there was a stillness that didn't feel like ordinary silence. I walked the perimeter of the building, looking for anyone, listening for anything. Footsteps, a car starting up, something to tell me the world still existed beyond this rest stop. Nothing. Even the road was completely empty. No distant headlights, no hum of an engine. I decided I couldn't just stand there. There had to be some house, some gas station, something down the road. I started walking in the direction I thought I'd come from, but the road felt wrong. After maybe 15 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen any markers or signs, and the rest stop was no longer visible behind me. When I looked back, the road just curved away into more darkness. I told myself I was just turned around. I turned back the other way, thinking I'd at least find the rest stop again. But after another 15 minutes, there was still nothing. It was like I'd stepped off the route entirely. I thought about how far I could realistically walk with no water, no food, and no idea where I was going. I sat down on the side of the road and tried to breathe, to think. I remembered passing a junction before the rest stop. If I could just get back to that, maybe I'd find something. I walked again, faster this time, until my legs were aching. Then, ahead of me, I saw a faint light. Finally. My chest loosened in relief. As I got closer, I realized it was the rest stop, the same one I'd left behind. I know how that sounds, but it was exactly the same. The benches, the vending machines, the same faint graffiti on the wall. Only now there was one difference. My bike was back, leaning against the bench exactly where I'd locked it. The lock was gone. I approached slowly, every instinct telling me not to touch it. My panniers were zipped shut, helmet hanging from the handlebars. I pulled one bag open. It was full, exactly as I'd packed it the night before. I don't know why, but instead of feeling relief, I felt a crawling dread up my spine. I grabbed the bike anyway. I mounted up, deciding I was just going to ride as far and as fast as I could until I found another person. The moment I reached the road, my phone buzzed. Signal bars were back, strong. My messages from last night sent all at once. I called my sister and blurted out everything. She told me to get to a hotel and rest, that she'd help me reroute in the morning. I found a small hotel about 10 kilometers away, checked in, locked my bike inside the room, and tried to convince myself I'd just had a bad night and gotten disoriented. But when I unpacked my panniers, I froze. My protein bar wrapper from the night before, the one I'd dropped next to the bench, was at the bottom of the bag. The next morning, I rode out of Perpignan on a different route. I checked my GPS carefully, and there was no rest stop at the location I'd marked. I even zoomed out, searched the whole area. Nothing. Just an unbroken stretch of road on the map. I finished the charity ride, but I never told anyone else about that night. I can't explain it without sounding like I've lost my mind, and maybe I have. But every time I think about it, I remember that one feeling more than anything else, that whoever took my bike hadn't just stolen it. They'd borrowed it, and they'd put it back, knowing I'd find it. Story number 3. I was driving back from my mum's place in Inverness to Aberdeen, late on a Sunday evening. My little boy, Jamie, had been restless the whole way, fussing in the back seat, and I was worn down from the constant stops and starts. By the time we were halfway there, he was on the verge of a proper meltdown, so I decided to pull over at a lay-by just off the main road. My thinking was simple. Let him fall asleep properly before we carried on. It wasn't busy that night. I'd passed maybe 2 cars in the last 20 minutes. The lay-by was empty when I pulled in. I unbuckled my seatbelt, reached back, and rubbed Jamie's arm until he calmed down. Within a few minutes, he was out cold. His breathing evened, his little head lolled against the seat. I stayed sitting there, engine off, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic. About 10 minutes later, there was a sharp tap on my window. I jumped so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof. I turned, expecting maybe a police officer doing a routine check, but it was a man I didn't recognize. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, scruffy beard, wearing a dark jacket. What froze me was that he leaned down close and said my name. Not Miss or Love, but my actual name, Sarah. I didn't roll the window down. I just stared at him. "Sorry?" I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. He smiled slightly, not in a friendly way, and walked away without saying anything else. I watched him in my wing mirror until he vanished into the shadows at the far end of the lay-by. My heart was pounding, but I told myself there had to be some reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd seen me before in Aberdeen. Maybe he'd known my ex. Maybe I was just overreacting. 5, maybe 10 minutes later, there was another knock. This time it was softer, more deliberate, like he didn't want to startle me, which somehow made it worse. I turned my head slowly, and there he was again, bent low so his face was level with mine. "Sarah," he whispered, almost like it was a joke we were sharing. I didn't move. I think I was afraid that if I did, I'd trigger something. After a moment, he walked away again, same as before. I thought about starting the engine and driving off, but Jamie had only just settled, and I was scared that the noise and movement would wake him. I also kept telling myself that maybe he was harmless. Maybe this was just some drunk guy who thought I was someone else. But every time I tried to rationalize it, I'd hit the same wall. How did he know my name? The third knock came harder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I dialed 999 and told the operator where I was, that a man kept coming up to my car and saying my name. She stayed on the line with me, her voice calm, telling me to lock my doors, which I'd already done, and to stay put until the police arrived. She said they'd send a unit straight away. While I was talking, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. He was back, not knocking this time, just standing by the passenger side, peering in at Jamie. I nearly screamed at him, but I bit it back because I didn't want to wake my son. He looked up at me, smiled that same not-quite-right smile, and mouthed my name again. I told the operator he was right there. She told me to keep talking, to let her know what he was doing. But before I could describe it, he stepped away and disappeared again. The minutes crawled. Every noise outside made me flinch. I could see nothing but darkness beyond the faint glow from the dashboard. At one point I thought I heard footsteps circling the car, but I told myself it was my imagination. Then, without warning, the driver's side handle rattled. I screamed, and the operator's voice snapped me back. "Sarah, stay calm. The officers are almost there." The rattling stopped. Then came the sound of him dragging something along the side of the car. A coin, maybe? Or a key? Slow, deliberate scraping. I squeezed my eyes shut. Headlights finally swung into the lay-by, blinding me. A police car pulled up behind me and 2 officers got out. I was shaking so badly I could hardly explain what happened. They searched the area but came back saying there was no one there. No footprints in the gravel. No sign of anyone. One of them asked if I was sure about the man saying my name. I said yes, over and over. They took my details and suggested I follow them back into Aberdeen so they could be sure I got home safe. I agreed instantly. Jamie stayed asleep all the way back, blissfully unaware. But when we got home and I parked in front of the flat, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Scratched into the driver's side door, in long, uneven letters, was my name. Not Sarah in neat writing. It was jagged, angry, gouged right into the paint. I told the police, and they came out again the next day to take photos. They couldn't explain it. No CCTV on that stretch of road, no witnesses. They said it could have been someone who'd seen me in town before, maybe an ex-friend, maybe a stranger who'd overheard my name somewhere. But the way he said it, quietly, like he'd always known it, still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. For weeks afterwards, I couldn't drive at night without checking every mirror constantly. I kept imagining him stepping out from the dark at the next lay-by, knocking again, waiting for me to roll the window down. Even now, years later, I never stop the car at night unless I'm somewhere well lit, with people around. And I never ever assume that being alone means no one is watching. Story number 4. I was 17 and thought I was clever enough to handle the world. It was a Saturday in late summer, and I'd decided to hitchhike from Ipswich to a small seaside town called Aldeburgh. I'd done it before, though not often, and I told myself it was just a quick, cheap way to get there. My mum thought I was spending the day at a friend's house, and my friend thought I was at home. I liked the idea of being between stories, belonging to neither world for a little while. The first 2 lifts got me as far as a little village about halfway to the coast. It was quiet there, hardly any cars, and I started to think maybe I'd made a bad choice. Not because I was scared, but because I might just be waiting all afternoon for nothing. I was leaning on a wooden fence, wondering whether to just start walking the long road ahead, when I heard the low rumble of an engine coming from behind. I turned, and there it was. A white van, older, maybe from the early 70s. It slowed as it approached. The driver was a man in his 30s, maybe 40s, with dark hair and a face that looked friendly enough. He leaned across and called out through the open passenger window, "Where you headed, love?" "Aldeburgh," I said. He smiled, nodded, and reached over to push the passenger door open. "Hop in." "I can take you straight through. I didn't think twice. I climbed in, slamming the door, and he pulled away. The van smelled faintly of petrol and something else I couldn't quite place. Not bad, just unfamiliar. There were no seats in the back, just an empty, metal-lined space. We chatted a little at first. He asked where I was from, what I was doing, and I told him I was just going for the day, to walk along the beach and maybe get fish and chips. He said he did deliveries sometimes, odd jobs, that sort of thing. His voice was easygoing, but I noticed after a while that he wasn't really looking at me when I spoke. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, and the smile he gave now and then didn't quite reach them. We passed through another small village, and I pointed out the turn I usually took when I'd been here before. "You can drop me at the green up ahead," I said. "I'll be fine from there." He didn't slow down. I said, "You can drop me at the green," I repeated, a little louder. He glanced at me briefly, still smiling. "Nah, I'll take you right into Aldeburgh." "It's quicker this way," I sat back, thinking maybe he'd just misunderstood, though there'd been nothing to misunderstand. My stomach felt suddenly light, like I'd missed a step on a staircase. The road narrowed to a single lane with high hedges on either side. No pavements, no fields I could climb into, just a long, hemmed-in stretch. "I really don't mind walking from here," I said after a minute. My voice came out tighter than I wanted it to. "You're fine," he said, eyes still on the road. "Sit back." "You'll be there." In no time I stared at the hedges as we passed, wondering if I could jump out if we slowed enough. But the van kept a steady pace, and I knew if I tried and he caught me, things could turn ugly. After another few minutes, I tried again. "I've actually changed my mind. Could you let me out now?" No answer this time, just the faint hum of the engine and the road underneath. That was when the warmth in his voice disappeared completely. He wasn't trying to make conversation anymore. He was just driving, focused, both hands on the wheel. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I looked at the back of the van again. No way out there, of course. The passenger door was the only option, and it didn't have one of those push-up locks I could flick. It was the kind you had to twist from the inside, and I didn't know if it was even unlocked. "Why won't you let me out?" I asked. He smiled again, but it was quick and wrong. "Told you." "I'll get you where you're going," I wanted to shout, to threaten him, but I thought of how alone we were out here, and decided not to push him into whatever edge he might already be skirting. My hands were in my lap, clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. We drove like that for what felt like forever. Every bend in the road, I prayed for another car to come by. But there was nothing. When we finally reached a T-junction, instead of turning toward Aldeburgh, he turned the other way. "That's not the way to Aldeburgh," I said sharply. He glanced at me again, almost casually. "Shortcut." I didn't know these back roads well enough to argue, but my gut told me this wasn't any shortcut. The lane here was even narrower, the hedges taller. I could see barely more than 20 feet ahead before the road curved again. I made myself breathe slowly, thinking through every possible move. I remembered my dad once saying that in some situations, you don't have to win. You just have to make enough noise or trouble that the other person gives up. So I shifted in my seat and reached for the handle. "Stop the van." Now his jaw tightened. "Don't be stupid." That was the first time his tone was openly sharp. It gave me just enough courage to push. "If you don't stop, I'll grab the wheel. You'll crash, and then we'll see who's stupid." He looked at me for a fraction too long, and the van wobbled slightly on the lane. Then he laughed. Short, dry. "Bloody hell. You've got some nerve." "Stop the van," I said again, louder. He didn't. But he slowed a little, almost without meaning to, I think. Maybe testing if I'd actually go for the wheel. That was all I needed. I grabbed the handle and shoved the door hard. It swung open, and the hedges blurred past. The van hadn't stopped, but it was going slow enough that I threw myself out and hit the ground in a tangle of elbows and knees. Pain shot up my leg, but I scrambled into the hedge before he could react. I heard the van brake hard, the door slam shut, the engine rev. I didn't look back. I pushed through the hedge into a field, stumbling, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear. I kept moving, crouched low, until I was far enough that the sound of the engine faded completely. Eventually, I reached another road, wider this time. A car came along within minutes, and I flagged it down, waving both arms. The driver, an older woman, stopped immediately. She took one look at me and told me to get in. I must have looked as shaken as I felt. I told her enough for her to understand I'd been in danger, and she drove me straight to the nearest police station. I gave them the best description I could of the man and the van, though I didn't know the plate number. They took it seriously. At least they seemed to. They asked if I wanted to call my parents, but I lied and said I'd already told them. I never heard if they caught him. I read the local paper for weeks afterward, waiting for some mention, but nothing came. I told myself that maybe he was just some odd man who didn't understand boundaries, but I knew that was a lie to make me sleep at night. People don't just ignore someone begging to get out of their vehicle. People don't take strange back roads when they're supposedly giving you a lift. For months afterward, I couldn't stand the sound of tires on gravel. I'd hear it from my bedroom at night and my chest would seize up until I remembered I was safe. I never hitchhiked again, not once. Even now, years later, I catch myself scanning the faces of drivers in older white vans, looking for the wrong smile, the eyes that never quite met mine. It's strange. You grow up thinking that danger is going to announce itself with a snarl or a shout or a knife in the dark. But it doesn't. Sometimes it's just a smile from behind a steering wheel and a voice saying, "Hop in," and you don't realize you've stepped over the line until there's no easy way back. I was lucky. I got out, That's the whole story, beginning to end. But I've never stopped wondering what would have happened if I hadn't. And I've never stopped hearing his voice, light and almost friendly, telling me to sit back and relax, while he took me somewhere I was never meant to be. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. Story number 5. We were on a tight budget. My wife, our 2 kids, and me driving through Penang, Malaysia, trying to soak in as much of Georgetown as we could without spending too much. It was supposed to be a short detour to grab some dinner before heading back to our modest guest house. But somehow, we got turned around. The GPS had stopped working properly, and the roads twisted into narrow alleys I didn't recognize. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the familiar buzz of the main streets faded into an eerie silence. Then, just when I was about to pull out my phone and try to figure out where we were, we saw it, a stretch of stalls lining a street none of us had ever seen before. We parked the car, figuring we might as well check it out before giving up and heading back. The place was like a night market, but not one that felt touristy or normal. Every single stall had rows of sealed glass jars on display. Inside those jars, something was moving. Small, strange creatures or things I couldn't quite identify. They twisted and pulsed in a way that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. The jars were all the same size, arranged carefully, almost obsessively, and every stall was selling the exact same thing. My wife and kids were curious but uneasy. My son, who's usually fearless, kept looking over his shoulder. The older woman running one stall caught my glance and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. I asked what was inside the jars, but she just shrugged and said, "Something special. For those who want it." No one else spoke. No one bargained or even called out to us like usual street vendors. We wandered deeper into the market, past more stalls filled with those identical jars. The moving things inside ranged from worm-like shapes to flickering shadows that shifted just at the edge of vision. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself it was just some kind of local delicacy, or perhaps a traditional medicine sold in a weird way. My wife looked more disturbed, and the kids were holding tightly onto each other. Then I noticed something else. No other customers, just us and the vendors, who seemed more like watchers than sellers. A man standing behind one stall leaned forward, holding a jar up to the light. Inside was a tiny, translucent creature, pulsing rhythmically, like it was alive but trapped. When our eyes met, his expression didn't change, but I felt a cold prick of dread. I wanted to leave. I told the family, and we turned back toward the car. But as we retraced our steps, the market seemed to stretch on endlessly. The stalls kept coming, the jars kept appearing, like the street had no end. I started to panic, realizing that we couldn't find the way out. My wife whispered that she felt like the market was alive, watching us, trying to trap us. Our kids were getting scared and wanted to go home. We quickened our pace, but the street twisted in impossible ways, doubling back on itself. I grabbed one of the jars from a stall, as if to anchor myself to something real. The creature inside was writhing, darker now, almost sinister. Suddenly, the vendors began to close their stalls slowly, the lids of jars clicking shut. Their eyes never left us. A man from one stall stepped forward and said, "You've seen what you shouldn't." "You can't leave empty-handed." I pulled my hand back, but he grabbed my wrist with an unnatural strength. His voice dropped low. "You belong to the market now." That's when I felt it. The cold creeping inside my skin, the slow creeping paralysis that spread from my hand to my arm. My family shouted for me to fight it, but my body wouldn't respond. The jars started glowing faintly, the creatures inside pulsing faster, like they were feeding on something. In desperation, I dropped the jar and shoved the man away. The paralysis retreated, and I grabbed my wife and kids, dragging them with me. We ran, blindly, through the labyrinth of stalls. The street seemed to contract, the jar's pulsing light chasing us like a heartbeat growing louder in the dark. At last, after what felt like hours, we burst onto a familiar road. The night market was gone, just an ordinary street lit by the usual streetlights. We didn't look back. Back at the guest house, we tried to make sense of what happened. The jars, the creatures inside, the way the market trapped us. I still don't know if it was a dream or something worse. But the strangest thing? The jar I dropped by the man's stall was in my backpack. We had never picked it up. I opened it later, alone, and saw the creature inside, writhing, pulsing. But something was different now. It was quieter, less frantic. As I stared, a wave of calm washed over me. It felt like it was watching me, waiting. I sealed the jar back up and locked it away. We left Penang the next day. I never told anyone the full story until now, because if I speak of it too loudly, I feel the market stirring again, and the pull of those jars calling me back to that lost street where time and reality bend and the night never ends. Story number 6. We had been driving for hours in a cramped van, 5 of us from different parts of the world, chasing something none of us could quite put into words. The idea was simple. Rent a van, explore Snæfellsjökull National Park in Iceland, and see where the road took us. We all wanted a break from routine, a chance to disconnect. But what actually happened changed everything. It started with Sigurd. He was the quiet one in the group, always carrying his camera around, capturing everything without saying much. That night, after setting up camp near a glacier wall, he said he wanted to take a walk alone to get some shots in the fading light. We didn't think much of it. He was familiar with the area and insisted he'd be back quickly. Hours passed, and Sigurd didn't return. We called out for him, shouted into the cold night, but there was no answer. Then one of us found his phone lying on the ground, screen still lit, video recording. It was pointed directly at the glacier wall we had camped beside. At first we thought maybe it caught something useful. We watched the video on the spot. The screen showed the glacier wall, dull and still for a long time. Then, the unthinkable happened. An enormous eye, impossible in size and shape, blinked slowly from inside the ice, staring directly into the camera. It wasn't just strange. It was terrifying. There was no way it could be a trick of light or an animal. This was something else, something alive inside the glacier. Panic set in immediately. We wanted to leave, but the van was parked a few kilometers away on a narrow gravel path. It was pitch dark, and the roads were unfamiliar. No one wanted to go alone, but no one wanted to stay either. We argued, but finally agreed that I and Anna would walk back to the van and drive it back to the camp, so we could all leave together. The walk back was tense. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack in the ice felt like a whisper. I kept thinking about Sigurd. What if that eye had been watching him? What if it had pulled him inside? Anna tried to keep calm, but her hands trembled. We reached the van, but when we turned it on, the battery was dead. Dead, like someone had been there, waiting, and drained it. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a distant, low rumble from the glacier wall. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but the ground didn't shake. The sound was steady, like breathing. We looked at each other, fear turning to disbelief. Then, from the van's rearview mirror, I saw movement, a shadow slipping behind the trees lining the path. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and locked them, heartbeats pounding so loud it felt like they would burst out of our chests. Anna tried calling for help, but there was no signal. We were trapped. Sigurd was gone, and whatever was inside the glacier was out there with us. We drove as fast as the narrow roads allowed, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave us. Every turn we took seemed to lead deeper into something we didn't understand. The van's headlights caught glimpses of something huge lurking just beyond the tree line. A shape, darker than the night itself, moving too fluidly to be an animal. By the time we reached the next settlement, dawn was breaking. The light didn't ease the fear. It only made the details clearer. We found a ranger station and showed the video. The ranger's face went pale, and he told us stories locals whispered about the glacier, that it was alive, a guardian of the land, ancient and vengeful. No one had seen it clearly before, but those who did never came back the same. We stayed with the ranger for a day, trying to make sense of everything. The others were shattered, unable to sleep or eat. Eventually, we reported Sigurd missing, but the police found nothing. No tracks, no clues, just an abandoned campsite and a haunting video. In the weeks that followed, the memory of that eye haunted me. I kept replaying the video, searching for answers. I realized the eye wasn't just watching. It seemed aware of us, almost curious. That's the worst part. Whatever it was inside the glacier wasn't mindless. It was something ancient, aware, and we had disturbed it. We never returned to that place. The others left Iceland soon after, each dealing with the experience in their own way. Me, I'm still trying to understand what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched, like that eye is still there, somewhere beneath the ice, waiting for the next group of strangers to come too close. The glacier keeps its secrets, but now I know one thing for sure. Some eyes shouldn't be awakened. Story number 7. It was the second week of the school break, and I'd decided to take a short road trip just to get out of Salala for a while. My plan was simple. Follow the GPS toward a small desert village I'd heard about from a colleague, see it, turn around, and be back before sunset. I left early, packed some snacks, water, and filled the fuel tank to full. It was supposed to be a quick, uneventful drive, but the GPS had other plans. The first sign that something wasn't right came when the road I was on began to narrow. The asphalt ended, and I found myself driving on hard-packed dirt. I hesitated, but the GPS kept confidently telling me to keep going straight, so I trusted it. I'd driven on worse roads before, and it didn't seem too bad. But then, after another 30 minutes, the road disappeared completely. The screen still showed a clear path ahead, so I kept driving slowly, thinking maybe this was just one of those rural stretches that would connect back to a main road. That was when I saw the dust trail in my rear-view mirror. A pickup truck was approaching from behind, moving fast. I felt a small wave of relief. I thought maybe it was someone local who could give me directions. The truck slowed down as it got closer, then kept a steady distance behind me. I kept waiting for them to overtake, but they didn't. I waved my hand out the window once. Just a friendly gesture, but there was no response. The minutes started stretching. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just heading the same way. But the road ahead was nothing but flat emptiness now. No villages, no sign of life, no cell signal. I checked my fuel gauge. Still just over half a tank. I kept driving, but every time I looked in the mirror, the same dusty pickup was there. Never closer, never farther. After about 40 minutes, my GPS calmly told me to continue straight for 80 kilometers. That number hit me like a punch. I had already gone too far to easily turn back, and if I did, I'd be face to face with the pickup. So I kept moving forward, hoping this route would eventually connect to something real. My mouth was dry, but I didn't want to slow down to drink water. The idea of stopping with them behind me made my skin crawl. The truck stayed exactly the same distance behind me for over an hour. It wasn't until my fuel light came on that the panic really began to set in. I realized I'd misjudged how far I could go off-road with my tank, and I had no idea where the nearest fuel station was. I stopped looking at the GPS entirely. I didn't trust it anymore. My thoughts became this repetitive loop. Keep driving. Don't stop. Just keep going. Then, without warning, the pickup sped up. My chest tightened. They closed the gap between us in seconds, then swerved slightly to the left, like they were about to overtake me. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt. They didn't pass. Instead, they stayed directly beside me, matching my speed. I couldn't bring myself to look at the driver. My peripheral vision caught only a vague shape inside. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. After maybe 30 seconds like that, they suddenly slowed back down again and returned to following me from behind. I didn't understand it. If they wanted to pass, they had the space. If they wanted me to stop, they could have forced me. The fact that they didn't made it worse, somehow. It was deliberate. They wanted me to know they were there. The fuel gauge was now in the red. I thought about stopping and confronting them, but the idea made my legs weak. My best option seemed to be to just keep going until I hit something, anything. But the horizon never changed. No buildings, no signs, just more nothing. Finally, the engine began to sputter. My stomach dropped. I tried to push it as far as I could, but within minutes, the car rolled to a stop. I sat there, hands frozen on the wheel, watching the pickup approach. They didn't stop right behind me. Instead, they pulled up alongside my car and stopped about 5 meters ahead, angled slightly toward me. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was wearing a long white dishdasha and a cap, and he moved slowly, not in any kind of hurry. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at my car. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My phone was useless. My options were non-existent. Then he walked to the back of his truck, opened it, and pulled out a yellow fuel container. Without looking at me, he walked to my car, opened the fuel tank, and started pouring. I was so shocked I didn't move. When he was done, he closed the cap, walked back to his truck, and set the container inside. He didn't ask for money. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me once, a quick glance, unreadable, then got into his truck and drove off in the direction we'd been heading. I sat there for what felt like a long time, trying to process it. When I finally started my car again, I followed the same track. About 20 kilometers later, I reached a paved road that led me to a small town with a fuel station. I filled my tank, and as I stood there, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see the pickup again. But it never appeared. I still don't know if he'd been following me to help from the start, or if something changed his mind halfway through. I've replayed it 100 times in my head, and there's no clear answer. All I know is that for over 100 kilometers, I was sure something terrible was going to happen. And maybe it almost did. Or maybe I just misunderstood everything. But I've never trusted a GPS since. Story number 8. It was late autumn of 1985, and I was driving back to Plovdiv from Sofia after visiting my parents for the weekend. I was in my 3rd year at the university, and most of my life revolved around lectures, late nights in the library, and cheap dinners with classmates. The drive itself was familiar, the road worn into my memory from countless trips, so I didn't think much about the checkpoint until I saw it up ahead. There was nothing unusual about military checkpoints in those days. They'd pop up without warning, manned by conscripts who looked barely older than I was, rifles slung carelessly, but their faces serious. I slowed as I approached, rolled down my window, and waited for the young guard to wave me through. But he didn't. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, and asked for my papers. I handed over my ID and vehicle documents, expecting the routine minute or two of checking before being waved on. Instead, he looked at the papers for longer than necessary, glanced back toward the small guard shack, and called over another soldier. They spoke quietly, too low for me to make out the words. Then the second soldier came up to my window and told me to pull over to the side of the road. I did as I was told, easing the car onto the narrow strip beside the asphalt. "What's the problem?" I asked, keeping my tone polite. "You didn't raise your voice to soldiers." He didn't answer directly. "Wait here. You can't go forward. You can't go back either." The phrasing caught me off guard. "What do you mean I can't go back?" "Orders," he said, before walking away toward the shack. I sat there, engine idling, feeling a small but growing knot of unease in my stomach. The checkpoint wasn't blocking traffic in both directions, at least not from what I could see. But within the next 15 minutes, a few other cars arrived from both directions and were similarly stopped. The guards positioned them in a loose line along the roadside, each driver told to wait. An older man in the car behind me got out after half an hour, lit a cigarette, and tried speaking to one of the soldiers. The soldier barked at him to get back inside. That seemed to kill any thought of collective protest. People stayed in their vehicles, windows up, eyes straight ahead. Time passed strangely there. An hour became 2. No explanation was given, no movement toward resolving whatever orders had frozen us in place. I considered turning the car around anyway. What could they do if I just drove back the way I came? But the sight of the rifles kept that idea buried. By the 3rd hour, I was getting restless, my legs cramped from sitting. I thought about honking the horn, if only to force some acknowledgement from the guards. But before I could decide, one of them approached. He didn't look at me directly, just walked past toward the last car in line, scanning the drivers as he moved. Something about the way he avoided eye contact made my skin prickle. Then, just as abruptly as they had stopped us, the guards disappeared. It wasn't a formal dismissal or an order to move on. They were simply gone. I realized it when I looked up from the steering wheel and saw the shack empty. The soldiers weren't at the roadblocks, weren't standing around talking, weren't anywhere I could see. The whole place felt deserted. I stepped out of the car, finally stretching my legs. The other drivers were doing the same, murmuring to one another in confused tones. Some walked toward the shack to see if anyone was inside, but came back shaking their heads. That was when I noticed the road was empty in both directions. Not just light traffic, completely empty. I could see far along the straight stretches, and there wasn't a single car, truck, or bus moving toward us. No sound of engines in the distance. Nothing. The unease I'd felt earlier hardened into something heavier. The others seemed to feel it too, because nobody rushed to leave. We just stood around awkwardly, watching the horizon. Eventually, I decided I'd had enough of waiting and got back into my car. When I turned the ignition, nothing happened. The key turned smoothly, but there wasn't even the sound of the starter. I tried again, pumping the pedal, but it was like the battery had been ripped out. I popped the hood, thinking maybe the wires had come loose, and that was when my stomach dropped. The engine wasn't there. I stepped back, blinking hard, telling myself I must be seeing wrong. But no. The entire block, every major component, was gone. All that remained were a few hoses and wires dangling like torn veins. My hands started to shake as I went to the car behind mine. The older man was already lifting his hood. Same thing. His engine was gone. One by one, drivers began checking their cars. Not a single one had an engine. Every vehicle, in perfect silence, had been stripped clean, while we'd been sitting in them. I can't explain the exact sensation of that moment, only that it wasn't panic, not exactly. It was a realization that something had been happening all along, right in front of us, and we hadn't noticed. A violation so complete that it felt unreal. Nobody had seen anyone working on the cars. Nobody had heard tools, or engines being lowered, or even footsteps. We were there the whole time, and yet we might as well have been unconscious for hours. The older man started shouting, demanding to know who was responsible, his voice echoing in the emptiness. No one answered. One of the younger drivers decided to walk toward Plovdiv, saying he'd find help. He disappeared over the rise in the road. 20 minutes passed, then 40. He didn't come back. After an hour, 2 others tried walking in the opposite direction toward Sofia. Same result. They just didn't return. It was late in the afternoon by then, the light beginning to fade. We were still without engines, without movement, without a single sign of another person on the road. My mind began to pick at itself. Had I imagined the guards? Had we all? But no. I remembered the feel of my papers leaving my hand, the clipped tone of, "You can't go back." We ended up in a loose group near the shack as night approached. There was talk of sleeping in the cars, waiting for morning, but something about the road being empty for so long made me dread staying in place. The thought of that complete stillness continuing through the night made my skin crawl. I suggested we walk together, all of us, toward Plovdiv. Safety in numbers, I said. Most agreed, though a couple of people refused to leave their cars. So we started walking, a mismatched procession of students, workers, and one family with a small child. The road stretched ahead, unbroken by headlights or street lamps. We walked for hours, but Plovdiv never seemed closer. No road signs appeared, no familiar landmarks, just the same stretch of pavement repeating under our feet. At some point, I realized I could no longer see the 2 people at the back of our group. Then another was gone. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, didn't hear cries for help. They were simply no longer there when I looked around. By the time I turned my head again, only the small family remained with me. The parents whispered to each other in tight, fearful tones. We agreed not to stop, not for any reason. But it didn't matter. A few minutes later, I glanced to my left and saw only empty road. The family was gone. I was alone. I kept walking, partly because I didn't know what else to do, partly because stopping felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. My thoughts looped. Had I been drugged? Hypnotized? Was this some experiment by the military? None of it explained the silence, the missing people, the vanishing cars. Eventually, without any change in the scenery or any sign of an approaching city, my legs gave out. I sat in the middle of the road, too tired to care. I thought about my dorm room in Plovdiv, about the half-finished essay on my desk, about how utterly ordinary the morning had been. When I woke, it was daylight. I was lying in the driver's seat of my car. The engine was back under the hood. My papers were on the passenger seat. There were no other cars around, no shack, no soldiers, nothing to mark where the checkpoint had been. I started the engine. It roared to life as if nothing had happened. I drove the rest of the way to Plovdiv without seeing another soul. For weeks, I told myself it had been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, but the odometer reading was higher than it should have been. And sometimes, when I drive that road even now, I'll glance at the horizon and think I see figures standing across it, waiting. Story number 9. I was 12 years old when my uncle Liviu decided to take me with him on one of his delivery trips to Sibiu. My parents thought it would be good for me to see more of the country, and I thought it would be fun just to be on the road with him, He was my mother's younger brother, the kind of man who could make even the dullest errand feel like an adventure. He drove an old green Dacia, the kind that rattled when you changed gears but somehow never broke down completely. We left early in the morning, and by noon we had finished the delivery and were on our way back, taking the national road that cut through stretches of farmland and small villages. About halfway home, I noticed a small roadside stand. It wasn't much, just a wooden table with crates stacked on top and a couple of people standing behind it. From a distance, it looked like they were selling apples and maybe tomatoes. My uncle slowed down without me even asking. He always liked to stop for fresh produce, saying the stuff in the city was garbage compared to what farmers sold on the road. As we got closer, I saw that there were 3 men, not 2. One of them, tall and wiry, waved us over with a big grin. His teeth were stained yellow, and he wore a faded denim jacket with the sleeves rolled up. We pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the Dacia crunching to a stop. My uncle greeted them in his usual cheerful way, asking how much the apples were. They didn't answer right away. The tall man stepped closer, and I noticed the other 2 had spread out slightly, one to the side of our car, the other hanging back near the crates. The one on the side bent slightly, as if pretending to check the car's tires, but his eyes were fixed on my uncle. "You're far from home," the tall one said finally. His grin didn't fade, but there was no friendliness in it now. My uncle gave a polite chuckle and said we were just passing through. Then, almost casually, the tall man pulled a knife from the pocket of his jacket. Not a kitchen knife, but a folding one with a long, narrow blade. He pointed it toward the ground, but angled it just enough so we could see it clearly. "Get out of the car," he said, still smiling. My uncle froze for half a second, then lifted his hands slightly. "We don't want trouble," he said. The man beside the crates reached under the table and pulled out something metallic. At first I thought it was a tool, but when he stepped into the sunlight, I saw it was a sawed-off shotgun. My stomach flipped so fast I felt like I might throw up. "Both of you. Out. Slowly," the tall man said. My uncle's voice stayed calm, but I could hear the tightness in it as he told me to open my door. My hands felt numb on the handle, but I did as he said. The gravel bit into the soles of my sneakers as I stepped out. My uncle joined me, his hands raised shoulder height. The man with the shotgun moved closer to the driver's side door, and the third one, the one who had pretended to check our tire, stood behind us now. I didn't dare look at him. The tall man's grin widened. "Take off your shoes," he said. For a second, I thought I'd heard wrong. My uncle blinked. "What?" The man flicked the knife upward. "Shoes off. Both of you." My uncle nodded slightly, kicked off his loafers, and looked at me. My fingers fumbled with my laces. I couldn't feel the ground properly now, just the jagged edges of the gravel digging into my bare feet once they were off. "Now," the man said, "you're going to walk." That way he pointed down the road in the direction we had come from. "And keep walking until we can't see you anymore. If you look back, we'll know, and if you run—" He let the rest hang in the air, but I didn't need him to finish. The man with the shotgun was already sliding into the driver's seat of our Dacia. My uncle took my arm and started walking. The gravel was hot and sharp, each step sending little spikes of pain through my feet. I wanted to look back so badly, to see if they were following, but my uncle's grip tightened every time my head twitched even slightly. We walked in silence, the sound of our bare feet on the rough road louder than I thought possible. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Every now and then, I heard a car in the distance, but none passed us. The road felt endless. After what must have been 5 minutes, my uncle whispered, "Okay." "Stop." We both turned slowly. The spot where we had stopped was empty. No table, no men, no car. They were gone. My uncle exhaled, but it wasn't relief. More like a sharp release of tension, knowing the danger was past, but the problem had just begun. We were barefoot, miles from the nearest town, with no money, no phone, and nothing but the clothes on our backs. We started walking again, this time toward the nearest village. My feet were already raw from the gravel, but there was no choice. My uncle tried to keep the mood light, telling me that this would make a good story someday. I didn't believe him. I felt hollow, my mind replaying the moment that Shotgun appeared. I kept thinking about how easily they could have done worse. It took us over an hour to reach the village. A few people stared at us as we passed, but no one stopped until an older man tending to his garden called out, asking why we were barefoot. My uncle told him we'd been robbed. The man didn't ask many questions, just nodded grimly and went inside to call the police. While we waited on his porch, he brought out 2 pairs of worn slippers for us to wear. My uncle thanked him more than once. The police arrived after half an hour. 2 officers in an old patrol car took our statements, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't expect to find our car or the men who had taken it. This kind of thing wasn't rare in those days, and the countryside was full of places where you could disappear, quickly. One of them did drive us back toward the spot where it had happened, but of course there was nothing left. Just empty road. By evening, we were back home. My mother cried when she saw us, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. My father shook my uncle's hand, though his jaw was tight. They were grateful we were safe, but I could feel the heaviness in the house that night. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the realization that even in broad daylight, on a public road, something like that could happen. For weeks afterward, I found myself scanning the sides of the road whenever we drove anywhere. If I saw a roadside stand, even an innocent one, my stomach would tighten. I never again believed that every smile from a stranger meant kindness. That day in Sibiu taught me something my 12-year-old self hadn't wanted to know. That danger doesn't always come in the form you expect, and sometimes the worst moments happen without warning, without reason, and without a chance to fight back. My uncle got another car eventually, and we still went on trips together. But we never stopped for roadside produce again. Not once. Story number 10. When I was 27, I took a temporary position at a small Catholic psychiatric facility in Lübeck called St. Margaret's. It wasn't my first time working in a psychiatric ward, but this place had a different feel to it from the start. It was run by an old order of nuns, but only a handful still lived there. Most of the patients were lay people, though a few were former clergy. My assignment was to work the night shift for one patient in particular, Sister Agnes. She was 59, rail-thin, with sharp eyes that never seemed to blink enough. They told me she had suffered a nervous collapse several years earlier after serving decades in a convent school. Her delusions, they said, revolved around believing she received messages from God. She wrote compulsively in a journal. Most of the staff had stopped reading it long ago because it was, as they put it, gibberish. The first night, she didn't speak to me. She just sat at her little desk, hunched over the pages, scratching away with her pen. I introduced myself, told her I'd be there through the night, and she looked at me with a slight nod before returning to her writing. I checked her vitals, made sure she had water, and settled into the chair in the corner. Around midnight, she quietly closed the book, placed it under her pillow, and lay down without a word. The second night, she spoke. Not much, but enough. She asked if I believed in prophecy. I said I believed people sometimes sensed things before they happened. She stared at me for a moment, then said, "Some things are too heavy to sense." "They're given," I asked what she meant. She smiled, not warmly, and went back to writing. The days blurred together. My job was simple. Keep her safe, make sure she didn't harm herself, and try to encourage rest. She never showed aggression, but her constant writing and muttering were strange enough to make me uneasy. I began to notice a pattern. Each morning, before the day staff arrived, she tore out a single page from her journal and slipped it into the drawer of her nightstand. I never looked at them at first. It felt like an invasion of her privacy. That changed on my 6th night. Around 2 a.m, she fell asleep in her chair, the pen slipping from her hand. Her journal lay open on the desk. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, boredom, but I stepped over and glanced at the page. The handwriting was small, tight, and slanted. I expected religious rambling, but instead I read, February 14th. Friedrich Keller, baker on Breite Strasse. Chest will stop. Daughter will find him at 6:10. It was specific. Too specific. I frowned and turned the page. The next entry was similar, dated 2 days later. February 16th. Child, 8, name Inga, slipped in pond by Linden Park. Could not be pulled. I put the journal back and sat down, unsettled. I told myself it was nothing more than her illness playing out on paper. The next night, she didn't write. She sat at her desk with the journal open, but her eyes fixed on me. "You read them," she said. I tried to deflect, but she smiled faintly. "It's fine. You should know what's coming. So you can prepare for what?" I asked. "For your turn." I laughed awkwardly, hoping to brush it off. She didn't. "It's not for me to decide," she said, "only to pass along what is given." The following morning, after my shift ended, I went to the small cafe near the hospital for coffee. That's when I overheard 2 older men talking. They mentioned a baker who had been found dead in his shop early that morning. Friedrich Keller. Heart attack. Found by his daughter. My hands went cold around the coffee cup. I told myself it was coincidence. It had to be. But when I came back for my next shift, I went straight to her nightstand drawer and checked. The 14th of February page was there, folded neatly. 3 days later, the story about the drowned girl was in the newspaper. 8 years old. Inge. Linden Park Pond. I didn't tell anyone at the hospital. What was I supposed to say? That a psychiatric patient was predicting deaths? They'd think I was losing my mind. But I kept reading her pages. Every one of them described someone in town, a date, and the way they would die. Each one, so far, had come true. Then, one night in late February, I found a page that froze me where I stood. March 3rd. Nurse, 27, new to St. Margaret's, alone in flat, hands around her throat. Will not breathe again. I didn't want to believe it was me. It didn't mention my name, but the description was too precise to ignore. I was 27. New to St. Margaret's, lived alone. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she meant another nurse. Maybe it was just part of her illness. I confronted her. She didn't deny it. "You can't change it," she said softly. "But you can be ready. Sometimes being ready is the only mercy." That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified. I locked the door, checked it twice, even pushed a chair under the knob. The date loomed in my mind like a black cloud. On March 2nd, the page for my predicted death was missing from her drawer. I searched everywhere in her room while she sat watching me. "It's not for you anymore," she said. "It's for them." She wouldn't say who them was. When my shift ended at dawn, I walked home feeling like a hunted animal. I decided I'd spend the night somewhere else, maybe at a colleague's place, but I didn't want to explain why. That evening, before I could arrange anything, I got a call from the hospital asking if I could cover an unexpected night shift. I hesitated. If I stayed at work, maybe I'd be safe. I agreed. At 2 a.m, I stepped into Sister Agnes's room. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, the journal open in her lap. She looked up and said, "It won't be here." "It will be where you belong." I didn't know what she meant. I sat down in the corner and tried to keep my breathing steady. Around 3, I felt myself drifting into a half-sleep. That's when she spoke again. "I told you. Ready is the only mercy." Suddenly the door to her room opened. It was one of the orderlies, Matthias. He was a big man, normally friendly, but in that moment something in his face looked wrong, like he wasn't fully present. He stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him. I stood. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, then at Sister Agnes. She didn't move, just kept her gaze fixed on him. Then, almost casually, he said, "You shouldn't be here." My skin prickled. I started toward the door, but he stepped between me and the exit. "It's quiet now," he said. His voice was flat, distant. "No one will come." I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. "Matthias," I said carefully, "I think you should step outside." He moved closer, and in that instant I saw his hands twitch, the smallest movement, but enough to make me realize exactly what was about to happen. I shoved past him, throwing my whole weight into the motion. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back so hard I hit the wall. I kicked at him, screaming, the sound raw and loud in the stillness, and then it was over. 2 other orderlies burst through the door, pulled him off me, and dragged him out. My knees buckled. Sister Agnes hadn't moved. She simply closed her journal and said, "You see? It was here, not there. That's why you lived." They told me later that Matthias had been acting strangely for weeks. Some kind of breakdown, they said. He was taken to another facility. No one could explain why he'd gone into her room, or what exactly he'd intended to do. Though I knew. I'd felt it in the way his hands gripped my arms. I wanted to quit that night. But some part of me needed to understand her. I stayed. I watched her write. I never read another page without her permission. In the weeks that followed, her predictions continued. Some were mundane, some were horrific. All came true. She never wrote about me again. I left St. Margaret's 3 months later. The night before my last shift, she handed me a folded page. My heart pounded as I opened it. It read, "June 12th, departure without death. The road will not be your end. It was the only prophecy she ever gave me that promised survival." I clung to it like a shield. June 12th came. I boarded the train out of Lübeck, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I never saw her after that. I don't know what became of her, or whether she's still alive. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the way she looked at me when she said, "Ready is the only mercy." And I wonder how many people in that town ever had the chance to be ready. Story number 11. I never planned to talk about that trip again. But sometimes the weight of silence becomes heavier than the memories themselves. It was the summer of 1983 in Galway when 5 of us, me, Brendan, Siobhan, Declan, and Mary, borrowed an old blue van from Brendan's cousin for a weekend escape. We were 18, restless, eager to get away from our parents' watchful eyes and the small-town monotony. The plan was simple. Drive through the rural backroads, find somewhere quiet near the coast, camp, drink, laugh, and come home with stories we'd tell for years. Only one of us returned, and that was me. At first, everything felt ordinary, almost joyful. We threw our bags into the back. Siobhan stuffed a deck of cards into her jacket. Mary had a flask of whiskey, and Brendan was already talking about how he'd teach us a new drinking game he swore he'd made up himself. Declan, always the cautious one, reminded us the van wasn't exactly built for long trips, but we laughed him off. The van rattled down the road, and with every mile, it felt like we were shaking off the weight of our lives in Galway. We stopped in small towns, bought crisps and cheap cider, played music from a tinny cassette player, and sang along, our voices terrible but carefree. I remember thinking that night as we drove deeper into the countryside that nothing bad could possibly touch us. We were young and together, and that felt like enough. The turning point came when Brendan spotted a side road leading into thick woods. He shouted that we should take it, that it would be the perfect place to set up camp. I argued we should stay closer to a main road, but the others outvoted me, so we turned. The path narrowed quickly, barely wide enough for the van, branches scraping against the metal like fingernails. After 10 minutes, we stumbled onto a clearing. It wasn't marked on the map, and it looked like no one had been there in years. That should have been a warning. We parked and pulled out our bags. The mood stayed high at first. Jokes, drinks, a fire built from broken branches. I remember Siobhan telling a story about her uncle, who swore he'd seen something unnatural in the countryside years before. We all laughed, teased her, called it a typical ghost tale to spook us. But even while laughing, I noticed Mary staring off into the dark beyond the fire, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Later, when the fire had burned low and we were more drunk than sober, Brendan suggested exploring. He was restless, always the one looking for trouble. Against my protests, we grabbed torches and followed him along a faint trail leading out of the clearing. The deeper we went, the quieter everyone became. Even Brendan's bravado seemed to falter. The trail ended at a stone wall, moss-covered and crumbling. An opening had been carved into it long ago, leading into what looked like a circular enclosure. Inside were stones arranged in patterns, almost like a crude ring. Declan muttered it was some sort of old pagan site. Brendan laughed and climbed onto one of the stones, raising his arms in mock ceremony. His laughter echoed, but it didn't sound right. It bounced back at us too fast, too close, like the stones were answering him. Mary told him to get down. Her voice wasn't playful. It was sharp, panicked. She said we shouldn't be there. Brendan rolled his eyes, but something in her tone made him jump back down. That's when I realized Siobhan was no longer with us. We called her name, our voices breaking the silence, but there was no answer. We thought maybe she'd gone back to the clearing, but when we retraced our steps, she wasn't there. Her bag was, her jacket too, but no sign of her. At first, we argued. Maybe she was hiding, playing a prank. But the fear grew when minutes turned into an hour. Brendan and I searched the woods, torches cutting through the dark, shouting until our throats hurt. Declan stayed with Mary by the fire, both of them too shaken to move. We found nothing. No footprints beyond our own, no sign of anyone else. When we regrouped, panic set in. We debated going for help, but the nearest town was miles away, and the van was the only way out. Then, without warning, Mary stood up, staring into the trees. She whispered Siobhan's name like she'd heard her. We followed her gaze, but there was nothing. Mary suddenly bolted into the woods. Declan and I chased after her, but she moved faster than I thought possible. By the time we caught up, she was gone. We searched again, harder this time, but the woods seemed endless, every direction the same. When we returned to the clearing, Brendan was standing alone by the fire, pale as death. He said he'd heard voices while we were gone. Not just one, but many, whispering from the tree line. We accused him of trying to scare us, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't lying. Declan wanted to leave immediately. Brendan refused, saying we couldn't abandon the girls. I was torn, fear gnawing at me, but before we could decide, a sound cut through the clearing. It was laughter, Siobhan's laughter, high-pitched and familiar, coming from the trees. But it wasn't right. It was too drawn out, too hollow. Declan clamped his hands over his ears. Brendan shouted her name and ran towards the sound. I didn't follow. I couldn't move. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before I heard Brendan scream. Not a playful yell, not drunken noise, but a scream that clawed its way into my bones. Then silence. Declan grabbed me, his face wet with tears, and begged me to get in the van. I listened. We ran. We drove without direction, the headlights bouncing off trees, the van barely holding together. I don't know how long we drove before Declan insisted we stop, his hands trembling too much to grip the seat. We argued in whispers, afraid even to raise our voices, and finally exhaustion won. We decided to wait for daylight. But when I woke, Declan was gone. The passenger door was open, his seat empty. I shouted his name until my voice broke. There was no reply, only the woods pressing in, silent and endless. I drove alone back to Galway, numb, half mad with fear. When I returned the van, I said nothing. Not to Brendan's cousin, not to my parents, not to anyone. How could I? 4 friends had vanished, one after the other, and I was the only one left. I knew how it would sound. A ridiculous tale, impossible to believe. The police eventually asked questions when the others never came home. Families searched, posters went up, and rumors spread. Some said they'd run away, others whispered about accidents or foul play. I gave statements, careful, vague. I told them we'd gone camping and I'd lost track of the others. I never told them about the stone circle, the whispers, the laughter. Who would have believed me? Years passed. The case went cold. The families never got answers. I avoided the countryside, avoided vans, avoided talking about that summer. But the guilt never left. I was the one who argued against going down that road, but I hadn't fought hard enough. I was the one who watched Mary run off without stopping her. I was the one who froze when Brendan chased that laughter. And I was the one who woke to find Declan gone. I carried it all in silence until, decades later, curiosity finally overpowered fear. In 2003, I drove back to that area. I told myself I just wanted to see it in daylight, to prove it had all been some cruel trick of youth and alcohol. I found the side road, though it was more overgrown than before. I followed it to the clearing, parked, and stepped out. The fire pit was gone, overtaken by grass. But the trail to the stone circle remained. I walked it slowly, every step heavier than the last. When I reached the circle, the stones were still there, still arranged, still watching. And on the largest stone, carved deep into the surface, were 5 names. My blood ran cold. The names were ours, all 5. Mine included. I staggered back, my heart pounding. I had never carved those letters. None of us had. But they were there, weathered yet clear. Siobhan, Mary, Brendan, Declan, and me. That was when I understood. I hadn't escaped. I'd been marked like the rest. Somehow I was spared that night, left to carry the memory, the guilt, the story, left as proof. I never went back again. I swore I wouldn't speak of it, but silence hasn't protected me. I still hear them sometimes. Faint laughter, whispers, calling my name when I drive lonely roads. I see them in dreams, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They're waiting, and I know they won't wait forever. I was the only one who returned, but I've never truly come back. Story 12. I wasn't planning to give anyone a ride that night in Hobart. I'd finished my errands earlier than expected, grabbed some takeaway, and was on my way out of the city toward a small hostel I'd booked a few miles up the coast. It was 2008, and I was traveling alone, the kind of backpacker who liked drifting without a strict plan. I remember passing the square where the buskers usually played, and that's when I saw him. Thin, scruffy, maybe 18 or 19, strumming an old guitar that was badly out of tune. He had a half-open case in front of him with just a few coins inside, and the way he was singing made me pause. His voice was raw, not polished, but there was something haunting about it. When I walked past, he looked up and asked if I could give him a lift out of town. He said he needed to get to a small town north of Hobart, where his sister lived. I hesitated. Everything I'd ever been taught about traveling alone screamed at me not to do it, especially not for some kid I didn't know. But he looked harmless, almost fragile. His clothes were ragged, and I noticed a bruise on his arm. Against better judgment, I nodded and told him to hop in. He climbed into the passenger seat, thanked me quietly, and placed a battered notebook on his lap, the kind of book musicians use to jot down chords and lyrics. He kept one hand on it the whole time, almost protectively. I asked his name, but he mumbled something I couldn't catch and changed the subject by asking where I was from. We drove in silence for long stretches, broken up by the occasional question from him about my travels. The way he spoke was odd. His sentences trailed off, like he was distracted. At one point I asked about his music, and he clutched the notebook tighter, saying softly, "It's not just songs." That put me on edge. Something about the way he said it, not defensive but secretive, made me wonder what was in that book. I told myself not to pry. I just needed to drop him off and continue on my way. About 40 minutes later, I stopped at a small roadside rest area to stretch my legs and throw away the food wrappers from dinner. I left the car unlocked, thinking he'd sit quietly while I was gone. But when I returned, the passenger door was open, and he was gone. The notebook was sitting on the seat. I looked around the rest stop, called out once, then twice. Nothing. The place was quiet, no other cars, no footsteps in the gravel. It was like he'd just walked into the trees and disappeared. I felt uneasy. Why would he leave his precious notebook behind if he had simply stepped away? I picked it up and flipped it open. The first few pages were lyrics, scribbles of verses, half-written songs, but a dozen pages in, the tone shifted. There were numbers, long lists of them, written in neat columns. Some pages had drawings of ships and arrows pointing to ports along Tasmania's coast. Others had strange coded messages, sequences of letters. That made no sense at first glance. The more I turned the pages, the less it looked like a songwriter's notebook, and more like something dangerous, something I shouldn't be holding. I put the book back on the seat, suddenly nervous. I waited 15 minutes, thinking he'd return. He never did. I considered leaving the notebook there, but something in me didn't want to. Against my better judgment, I tucked it into my backpack and drove off. That night in the hostel, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about him, the bruise on his arm, the strange way he said the book wasn't just songs. I pulled it out again and studied the codes. After a while, I noticed some of the numbers matched coordinates like latitude and longitude. I didn't have much knowledge of navigation, but even with a quick check on the hostel's computer, I realized they pointed to small coastal towns and coves. Some were marked with notes like drop or collect. The next morning, I decided to show the book to a woman I'd met at the hostel, another traveler from Germany who had worked in shipping before. When she looked through it, her face went pale. She told me the notes resembled smuggling routes, possibly drugs or people, maybe both. She said I should get rid of it immediately. I wanted to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy had left it with me for a reason. Maybe he was running from the people connected to it. Maybe he had wanted someone to find it. I told myself I'd hand it to the police the next day. That evening, as I was returning to my car, I noticed a man leaning against the wall near the hostel. He was tall, built like a laborer, and smoking a cigarette. He didn't look at me directly, but as soon as I opened my car door, he flicked the cigarette to the ground and walked off toward the street. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen him before, and yet something about his timing felt deliberate. Driving away, I caught sight of a vehicle in my mirror following me. A white utility van, keeping its distance but never falling away. My hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just another driver on the same road. But every turn I made, it made two. I pulled into a petrol station, got out, and pretended to check my tires. The van parked at the far end of the lot. The driver didn't get out. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and when I came out, the van was gone. Relief washed over me, though it was thin and temporary. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel instead of returning to the hostel. I locked the door, pulled a chair against it, and sat on the bed with the notebook on my lap. I flipped through the pages again, hoping to find some explanation. Near the back, I found something new. Names. Dozens of them, listed under town names and dates. Some were crossed out. Some had ticks beside them. And then, to my shock, I saw one that matched the boy's first name, the one he'd mumbled in the car. It was underlined twice, with the word "lost" scrawled next to it. My throat went dry. He hadn't just vanished. He had been marked, catalogued, written down like inventory. I hardly slept that night. By morning I was shaking with the urge to hand the notebook to the police, but a thought gnawed at me. What if they were involved? What if handing it over put me on the same list? I drove aimlessly, my mind torn between fear and responsibility. By midday, the white van returned. I saw it in my mirror again, unmistakable. My heart hammered as I pressed the accelerator, taking random turns through back roads until I lost sight of it. I pulled over, chest tight, palms wet with sweat. That was the moment I realized keeping the notebook was no longer a choice. Whoever these people were, they knew I had it. That night, I drove straight to the Hobart police station. I forced myself through the doors, clutching the notebook so tightly my hands ached. I told the officer on duty everything. Picking up the boy, his disappearance, the codes, the van. He listened silently, his eyes flicking to the notebook when I set it down on the counter. He excused himself, took the book into a back room, and left me waiting. 15 minutes passed. Then another 15. The longer I sat there, the more dread I felt. Finally, another officer came out, not the same man, and told me they'd keep the book for investigation. He gave me a short, clipped thank you, and said I was free to go. Free. The word felt wrong. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. That night, I left Hobart, and didn't stop until I was hours away. In the months that followed, I checked the news constantly, searching for mention of smuggling rings being broken or bodies found along the coast. Nothing appeared. No reports, no arrests, nothing that could connect to what I'd handed over. The boy's face haunted me. His voice, the way he said it wasn't just songs, it all came back in flashes. I never saw anything in the papers about him either, not even a missing person report. Years later, when I look back, the memory still gnaws at me. I know what I saw in that notebook. I know what was written there, the coordinates, the names, the marks beside them. I know the van wasn't just coincidence, but what I'll never know is what happened to the boy. Did he mean to leave the book with me? Or was it a mistake? Did he survive? Or was he already marked for disappearance the moment he stepped into my car? I like to think he chose me. That he wanted someone, anyone, to carry his secret far enough that it couldn't be erased. Maybe the police buried it. Maybe the network was too powerful to touch. But at least I can tell this story. At least his name isn't just a word underlined twice in a hidden notebook. Even now, when I hear a guitar on the street, I find myself turning to look, half expecting to see him. But there's only ever some stranger, strumming their own songs, unaware of the one boy who vanished and left behind a book that should never have existed. And that's why I don't stop for hitchhikers anymore. Not because of danger, but because of the memory of him sitting in my car, clutching that notebook like it was his whole life. I carried it for only 2 days, and it nearly consumed me. He carried it for God knows how long, and it cost him everything. And that wraps up our journey through 12 Appalachian road trip horror stories. Which one chilled you the most? If you made it all the way, type "The roads are watching" in the comments, so I know you're one of the fearless travelers. Until next time, drive safe, and remember, some roads were never meant to be traveled.